Alexander realized that Eliza was devaluing everything he was doing. The wife was not satisfied with anything. She kept feeling that Alexander was doing everything wrong. He didn't make enough money. He didn't come home from work on time. He didn't sit at his desk like that. And he didn't even sleep right. Every now and then she did not hesitate to bring up examples of other men. Husbands of friends of Alexander, and even his own brother, with whom, as she well knew, the husband had a strained relationship. Alexander was ready to endure all the attacks, but when Eliza got to the point of comparing him to Kosty, Alexander immediately got angry. He would start swearing, yelling, and threatening divorce. Well, if they're all so good, Alexander was indignant. So why did you marry me? So you are not suitable for them. Yes, and then, as love you a fool, said in response to her husband Eliza. The man himself did not understand why he loves his wife so much. Despite all the offense, he quickly forgot everything and again was ready to carry his wife in his arms. That is how they lived for many years. They loved each other, they argued, but they were together. The grown-up son wondered how his mother and father were not divorced. When he asked his father that question, Alexander smiled and shrugged. It was a mystery to him and himself. One evening, Eliza came home from work and suddenly broke the news to her husband. She quit her job and has no plans for the next few months. I want to rest, she explained to her husband. Alexander had no choice but to accept her decision. So his wife began an indefinite vacation. Soon the man even liked that his beloved was at home. A delicious, hot dinner was always waiting for him in the evening, and rested Eliza was smiling at him. At some point, Alexander began to feel that there were fewer quarrels and tantrums, and it was as if there was peace in the family. His wife's lack of work benefited everyone at once. One day, Alexander found a pack of cigarettes hidden behind a shelf in the hallway. He was surprised because neither he nor his wife had smoked in years. He immediately thought of his son, and when he returned from school, he asked him about it. "Makar is yours," said his father directly. "I don't smoke, Dad." The young man shrugged his shoulders. Makar was in high school, and Alexander was well aware that this was exactly the time when young boys and girls thought that smoking was cool and tried not to stand out from the crowd with opposing views. He was not going to scold his son, which is what he told him, but Makar reiterated that he did not smoke, and this was the first time he had seen these cigarettes. His son's reaction was calm. His eyes did not run nervously, and he did not try to disassociate himself from what his father had said. He looked at Alexander calmly and confidently, and he surrendered his position by apologizing to the boy. In the evening, when Eliza returned from her manicure, he asked her about her find. "Oh, so it's Eve," said the woman, and we searched that time to see where she had gone. Eve was Eliza's best friend, but Alexander couldn't remember her smoking. He handed his wife a pack of cigarettes, and she promised to give them back to their owner. After a while, Alexander happened to meet Eve at the mall, where he went shopping. They talked a little bit about how everyone was doing, and then the man asked, "Did Eliza give the cigarettes back to you?" "I found them behind the rack." "What kind of cigarettes?" surprised the interlocutor. "God with you, I gave up Alexander back in school." "Yes, so I thought Eliza said they were yours," Alexander muttered. He said goodbye to his wife's friend and went about his business, mentally sorting out the situation. His first thought was that Makar had lied to his father, and his mother was covering up her son's addiction. Then suddenly another thought came out of the blue, a nasty, unpleasant thought. It made him sick, and he stopped right in the middle of the sales floor, ahead of the cart in which he was picking up his groceries. What if Eliza was cheating on him? He put the goods to himself in the cart mechanically, while he pondered what he should do now. At first, Alexander wanted to ask his wife directly why she had lied about the cigarette mistress. He wanted to find out if she was covering for Makar, and if so, why aren't they telling him? But after some more thought, the man dismissed the idea. He knew his wife too well to do just that. Upon hearing these questions of his, Eliza became furious and would shout. Even though the couple fought quite often, it was not good for Alexander at all now. Already on the way home, he had the thought of installing a hidden camera at home. After weighing the pros and cons, Alexander settled on this very idea. The days spent waiting for an order with a camera dragged on like an eternity. He constantly checked his mail to see if his order had arrived, but found nothing. It took 2 weeks for the purchase to arrive, and during that time, Alexander was on pins and needles. He began to think that he was literally seeing all the signs of his wife's infidelity. He was winding himself up terribly nervous. After figuring out the instructions and waiting until he was alone at home, Alexander finally stopped the camera. The man prayed that his wife would not think of getting in where he had put her, or everything would be ruined. It was a spooky time for Alexander. Every now and then he checked to see if anyone was in their house. No normal functioning was out of the question. All his energy was spent trying to figure out if his wife was cheating on him or not. More than once he had imagined seeing the man who owned those ill-fated cigarettes enter their apartment. Alexander had already developed a clear plan of action. He will record this moment on video and then show Eliza. She will not have the slightest chance to justify herself. Everything will have been decided for her. At home, the wife noticed that her husband suddenly began to drink. And indeed, to relieve a little stress, Alexander began to go more and more often after work to the nearest pub and take a couple of liters there for the evening. This new habit of his made Eliza freak out more than usual. Now to the other accusations against her husband added another. Married an alcoholic, very well. What's next? Drinking away the apartment. She snapped every time she saw her husband sitting on the sofa in front of the TV with a mug in his hands. Alexander was doing his best not to shout back at her. It was hard for him. Each time, after listening to the tirade, he sighed and replied as calmly as possible. It was only a mug of beer. But his wife did not listen to him and stuck to her line. Almost 3 weeks after installing the camera, Alexander finally saw what he wanted and feared most. Something suddenly, in the middle of the workday, urged him to turn on his phone and check what was going on at home. He could not believe his eyes. Eliza, dressed in a light lace robe, was opening the front door. Alexander jammed the record button, video, and continued to watch what was going on. His wife let in their apartment a thin, dark-haired man. Alexander, he wasn't familiar with, but he had a rock off his chest. More than anything, he was afraid of seeing his own brother. Such a betrayal a man would not have survived. Eliza and the stranger kissed. Alexander grew disgusted to see it. He covered his eyes through his lashes, watching what was happening from the view of the camera. Both disappeared. He stopped recording. The deluded husband didn't beat around the bush. That night, he handed his wife a phone with an interesting video of her on it. Eliza became angry and threw the cell phone to the floor with all her might. She started cursing at him again, angry that he was peeping at her. She was not paying attention to the fact that she herself was in the wrong in this situation in the first place. In defense of herself, she habitually shouted at her husband, trying to protect herself. Makar was not at all surprised when her father told him about the divorce. On the contrary, the young man sympathetically asked once again how he could hold on for so many years. Papa rubbed him on the head. He was glad to have such an understanding son growing up. Now, in the midst of everything else, the young man remained the only reason to rejoice. The apartment in which they all lived together the man left to his ex-wife, and most importantly Makar. He did not want the young man to lose his room and move somewhere in his last year, so he made concessions. Alexander himself rented a small apartment in another neighborhood. From his son, the man knew that his ex-wife, after the divorce, began to meet openly with his lover. One day, when Makar was already at university, he suddenly dropped in a conversation with his father that the lover had hit his mother, taken the money, and moved out of their apartment. Alexander wanted to ask his son for details, but the young man said nothing more. And so it turns out that we all think that the grass is greener in someone else's garden. We compare ourselves to others, thinking that this is our personal growth, but we find ourselves in an even worse situation. Eliza had experienced this for herself, and now regretted missing out on love with Alexander. The next story is no less interesting. It tells how the wife started fiddling with other men and was punished severely for it by her husband. You have to see it through to the end. Vera and Jackson were married for 5 years. Before that, they had been dating for a couple of years. And then during a joint vacation at the sea, Vera received the cherished proposal of marriage, and the wife had a large common company of friends from her university days. They loved to get together, travel, vacation, go to concerts. Jackson didn't fit in with that group from the beginning. He wasn't particularly interested in all their parties. He was a pretty private person. Once every few months he would go with his wife to these meetings, but for the most part she didn't insist either, seeing that he wasn't very comfortable with them. At first, Vera was angry at her husband for refusing to go out with her. She called Jackson very boring, but then she realized it was useless to fight. One day, another meeting with friends, to which Jackson, as usual, did not go, came with an unexpected surprise. Their mutual friend Jody, whom they had not seen for many years since he had gone abroad for work, suddenly visited them and came to the apartment where they were meeting for the weekend. Everyone there was very fond of Jody. He was the soul of the company and always had something funny or interesting to say. And before, when he arranged general meetings, all the attention in the room was always focused on him. It turned out that his contract had expired, and while he was thinking about extending it or not, the man took a vacation and came to his hometown. All night long, all his friends asked him lively questions about his life in the European country, about the events he was going through. Vera did not take her eyes off the man during this time that they had not seen each other. He greatly changed, became handsome, pumped up, and did not lose his charm and charisma. Jody was pleased with this reaction from everyone, but especially Vera. Once upon a time, they might have started a relationship, but fate had turned out differently. At someone's birthday party, they had a drink, got frank, and found out that they had liked each other for a long time. That night, many years ago, they lost their heads and woke up together the next morning. Their relationship didn't work out because Jody had already been offered a job at that time. All the bureaucracy had been sorted out, and he was leaving for another country the very next week. Vera was upset, but she had nothing to do but move on with her life. Soon she met her future husband, and that crush on Jody gradually began to be forgotten. Jackson, she never talked about what happened between her and her friend. In the evening, when Vera returned home, she told her husband without a word about their friend returning from abroad and suddenly appearing at a meeting. She enthusiastically retold his stories as if she had participated in them herself. There was constant praise for Jody, and in some ways her husband was even hurt by the fire in Vera's eyes she spoke of him. Jackson interrupted her and made some brief remark about it to Jody. The woman was silent halfway through the sentence, looked resentfully into her husband's eyes, and said nothing more that night than good night before going to bed. A week had passed since the previous events. Vera couldn't get thoughts of Jody out of her head. She kept remembering how much fun she had had with him. How funny, he would finish sentences for her as if he could read her mind. Colleagues at work even noticed her absent-mindedness, constantly asking if she was getting enough sleep. Finally, no longer fighting with herself, Vera decided to write to Jody herself and ask him to meet her. To her delight, he responded fairly quickly and agreed. That evening, she texted her husband that she would have to work late, so he wouldn't have to wait for her for dinner. They met Jody at a cafe and chatted and laughed for a long time. The woman felt like she had felt years ago again, incredibly light and happy around this man. She didn't need any drinks. She was already drunk from the rush of these feelings. So she reacted with great enthusiasm to the offer to continue the pleasant conversation at Jody's house. But of course, it was not limited to mere conversation. From that day on, Vera lied to her husband that meetings with a group of friends became more frequent, and on weekdays, she constantly had extra things to do at work. Since Jackson didn't go to these meetings and didn't check anything out, he didn't suspect anything, and he was in complete ignorance of what was really going on for a while. One day, as Jackson was leaving work, he decided to take a short walk to clear his head. He knew his wife would be late again tonight, which meant he had nowhere to hurry. He always had time to heat up supper. The man was walking along, lost in thought, when someone called out to him from behind. "Jackson, hi. Haven't seen you in a while," Jim said to him as he came closer. It was one of Vera's friends, who was also in a large group. They shook hands and got to talking. "How is Vera?" "I haven't seen her for a long time either." "Is she doing well?" Jim asked. "Don't you see each other every week?" Jackson said perplexedly. "Yes, we haven't seen each other for a long time. Sometimes our schedules don't fit. Sometimes we all have things to do." The man grumbled disappointedly. Jackson stared at Jim for several seconds without blinking. He was trying to comprehend what he had just heard. "And when did you all see each other for the last time?" he asked. "Well, about a month and a half ago, when Jody came to live with us," Jim answered. Jackson was shocked. Jody was, of course, the friend his wife had been telling him about. And it was after that meeting that her frequent recycling began. Now he was clearly aware of what the delays at work and frequent meetings, supposedly with friends, were related to. He remembered that his wife was going to meet with the company again this Saturday. He asked Jim if there would be a meeting, and he said nothing of the sort had been planned. Jackson realized this and decided to see where Vera would actually go and catch her red-handed. On the appointed day, when his wife left, he used the app on his phone and looked up on the map where his wife was now. They agreed that they would put this app on for emergencies. And the wife was sure her husband would never just open it, because he trusted her completely. Half an hour later, Jackson had already pulled up to where his wife was. It was an ordinary apartment building. The man parked in front of one of the driveways and waited. Not even an hour later, his wife came out of the next doorway and started glancing at the phone screen, apparently checking to see where the cab was now. She looked very ruddy. The styling on her head was a little shot. Jackson honked at her from his car. Vera looked in his direction perplexedly at first, as if not recognizing the car, and then very slowly and unsurely walked toward her spouse. She opened the front passenger door and asked what he was doing here. Jackson calmly asked her to sit down. His wife silently obeyed him, and for half a minute they sat in silence. Vera, sensing the growing tension, could not stand it and asked, "What is going on?" The man said that he knew everything. He knew that there was no meeting and suggested that Vera should tell him where and with whom she was. Vera started to act like a victim who didn't understand, but Jackson had already lost all confidence in her. He yelled at her, and she finally confessed that she was with Jody. Her husband silently started the car and drove off. Vera asked with fear in her eyes where they were going. Jackson replied that he was going to pack her things because after that he wouldn't live with her for a day. The divorce was swift. Jackson was depressed and tried his best not to think about his betrayed wife anymore. And Vera herself was not too upset by what happened. She continued to date Jody, just now she could not hide. In her head, she had already fantasized about a strong and long relationship with her lover. Except she hadn't considered that Jody had told everyone at the first meeting that he was back here for a while. When she found out that she had a week left before she left, she said she was ready to go with him to the end of the world. The woman expected the man to help her with all the tickets and the visa, but Jody wasn't the kind of man who would just pay a woman for nothing. And Vera herself simply did not have that kind of money. She had forgotten that it wasn't her husband who could just buy or pay for something for her. For a long time, the woman had been in love with Jody, corresponded with him a lot. But when she found out that he had a steady girlfriend in the country where he lived, her heart broke and now she was alone with her problems. The realization came that she had ruined everything. A black sadness came over her like a blanket, from which there seemed to be no way out. Vera threw herself headlong into her work so that she wouldn't feel alone most of the day. But every night, she was alone with her broken heart. That's the story. Share in the comments what you think about this situation and the behavior of the characters.